Hello everyone, and welcome back to Zilog and Moto, as we start out our second season and begin 2020 anew. And what better way to start out a new year and season of Zilog and Moto than with a new game? While there aren't many of them out there, yes, there are still some crazy cats creating games to run on the old Motorola 68,000. And yes, I did just use the phrase crazy cat, so apparently I must have aged 20 years between Season 1 and Season 2. Today we're going to be talking about one of the other big releases to appear on the Genesis in 2019 besides Darius, and in this case, the game was actually released in a physical version that could be played on original hardware or other software or hardware emulation boxes, as opposed to how Darius was simply included with the Genesis Mini. And that game is XenoCrisis. XenoCrisis is a twin-stick shooter in the legacy of games like Robotron, Smash TV, and Total Carnage. XenoCrisis was created by a British company called Bitmap Bureau, who is also responsible for two other games so far in 88 Heroes and Ninja Showdown. And looking at those games, and now XenoCrisis, it's clear that Bitmap Bureau's name is definitely a homage to the Bitmap Brothers, another famous British developer who was responsible for games like Xenon, Speedball, and Soldiers of Fortune, or for the UK crowd, the Chaos Engine. We haven't looked at any of those titles yet, but we will eventually. The development of XenoCrisis has definitely followed a different path than 88 Heroes or Ninja Showdown. Those two titles are both aimed squarely at modern consoles and computers. However, for XenoCrisis, Bitmap Bureau decided to be much more ambitious. When all is said and done, along with versions for Switch, Xbox One, PS4, PC, Mac, and Linux, XenoCrisis will also have the support to the Genesis, Dreamcast, and Neo Geo of all things. Now, as I've discussed on Zilog and Moto before, the Genesis and the Neo Geo aren't that different from a technical perspective. So I'm not that surprised to see a Neo Geo development-wise, as much as I'm just shocked to see a Neo Geo game, period. And based on all the pictures so far of the shock box and cartridge, it looks really well done, so kudos to Bitmap Bureau for being absolutely insane. But we're not here to talk about the Neo Geo version of XenoCrisis, we're here to talk about the Genesis version. As nice as it is to get a new Genesis release after 1998, it's also important for those releases to actually be good. Technology has come a long way in the last 20 years, and while it may have been difficult for developers to design games in the 80s and 90s for these consoles, due to lack of or primitive tool sets, at this point, these architectures are known inside and out. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's easy to create a new Genesis game now. All I'm saying is that good, talented developers no longer have to deal with the roadblocks of inadequate software, hardware, documentation, etc. So at this point, if the result of the process is a mediocre game, that fault lies squarely at the feet of the development team. And before we go any further, I would just like to point out that I paid for this game with my own money and imported it to the United States, so all viewpoints in this review are squarely my own and not influenced by anyone at Bitmap Bureau or elsewhere. I'm not trying to sell a game here, I'm just sharing my experience with a new addition to the Genesis library. So, is XenoCrisis worth all the attention it's been getting? Does it feel like a solid addition to that great library of Genesis? Or is XenoCrisis a half-baked idea that got a lot of people excited for nothing, and it's just another action game for a console that already has plenty? Well, let's take a look. Okay, here is XenoCrisis, and before I go too far, I'd like to point something out. As you're probably aware, and I've mentioned before, specifically in the EA Hockey video, if you care to go check that out, the Genesis Mega Drive serviced 3 major regions, and a 4th if you include the lesser-known Asian PAL combination that appeared in places like Thailand. Bitmap Bureau has catered to all those regions for versions that reflect each of those versions of the Genesis/Mega Drive, and we'll examine that in a bit more depth as I go along, but just to be clear, the version that we're looking at today is the original US version. As you'd expect with this being a new game, the case is brand new, with no marks or any other issues. The case itself is of good quality construction and is nearly identical to an original Genesis clamshell case. I think it's important to point that out because there are cheap replacement cases out there and there's a definite quality difference between the two, so I'm glad they didn't go the cheap route with this. And for anyone considering picking up the Neo Geo version, if there's shock boxes or anything like these clamshells, it'll be a good product. The cover art is great, and I like how they retained the Genesis logo design up at the top, even though this is not a licensed title, and they just put their name there instead. Everything is proportioned well, and the logo looks great at the bottom. I really like the blue bleeding to red at the bottom. This is one of those tool benefits I was referring to before, where I'm sure laying out the cover was much easier to do in a current version of Adobe InDesign or whatever software they used than whatever was available in the mid-90s. And they even got one detail right that I'd missed before doing this review, which I'll show you now. Now, while I've played plenty of original Genesis titles, my first Genesis was a Sonic the Hedgehog system, which I got in the Christmas of '91. And here's what the copy of Sonic included in that Genesis bundle looks like. Now, notice one thing. See how the artwork here is inset in a box, and you've got the border actually going all around it. Compare that to XenoCrisis, which has the artwork going out all the way to the edge of the case. And the black cross-hatching is only down at the bottom in this angled section here. Now, I've always associated that angled style with the Mega Drive rather than the Genesis because I'm used to seeing this Sonic style on pre-Red Band Genesis titles rather than this angled style here because the Mega Drive the European cartridges always had this. But actually, if you go back a little bit further and look at an original Genesis release, like say Ghouls and Ghosts, if you look, you see that it has that same angled style and full artwork to the side as well. So, you know, I learn something new every day. I had no idea that or I just didn't realize that the actual original 89, 90 era Genesis titles really did look like this, and it wasn't just a European thing. And also, I mentioned how Bitmap Bureau sells the game in variations to match the versions of the Genesis / Mega Drive that are out there. They also give you an option to pick whether you want your copy of XenoCrisis to have the original style cover or updated style cover, which features a slightly different label on the cartridge as well as what would be referred to as either a red or blue band cover depending on your region. Bitmap Bureau, clever folk that they are, printed the cover to be double-sided. I'm going to show you that real quick. Open this up. And on the inside, I'm going to take this out. And there you go. So I've seen this on a few Blu-rays before, and also notably BioShock Infinite. But I think it's pretty cool. If I ever want to change things up a bit, I could just flip this around, and all of a sudden I've got the newer artwork rather than the original artwork. I don't know why I would want to do that, but you know, it's cool that I can. Now, the cartridge obviously doesn't change, and if you get the red banded, you know, if you specify this on your order, your cartridge label will be red banded as well. Also, one other note, the Japanese Mega Drive has a different cartridge slot. So a Japanese game won't fit in an American or European system without some help. But part of buying the Japanese version of XenoCrisis is the cartridge itself does come in a Japanese styled shape instead. And I would show what that looks like, but I haven't bought any Japanese releases yet, so I don't have any actual Japanese Mega Drive styled cartridges. But just, I can point out really quick, as opposed to having these cut edges here, the sides are bigger, they stick out. So
There's tabs in the American Genesis and the European Mega Drive that, because of the difference in shape, you just physically can't stick a Japanese cartridge down unless you make the opening wider by whatever means you choose. Let's see, back to the cover. The back cover is laid out just like a classic Genesis title, with the blue 1-2 player box up here at the top, and the same font that was used for the descriptions on the back. The screenshots are decent quality, as you can see there. But they look like they were taken on a PC running the game with scanline filter turned on, and I would have just left that alone, but that's just me. Bitmap Bureau sent me a nice looking postcard with the game that's got the full cover. That's nice. I did not expect to get that. And the manual itself looks fantastic. And I've lamented many times that Genesis manuals are always black and white, which was especially frustrating since the SNES got color manuals. But thankfully, they weren't that authentic with the Genesis release. And we finally have a color manual with screenshots and other pictures. Really nice to finally see that on a Genesis release. Okay, enough of this package. This has taken way too long. Is this game worth playing? Well, spoiler alert, yes it is. As I mentioned earlier, at its core, XenoCrisis is a twin-stick shooter. What is a twin-stick shooter, you ask? Well, probably the most well-known example of a twin-stick shooter is Smash TV, which we'll get to in a future episode. But if you're not familiar with Smash TV, its sequel Total Carnage, which unfortunately did not appear on the Genesis, or their granddad Roboton 2084, a twin-stick shooter is a game without buttons, where you control your character instead with two joysticks, one for the direction of movement your player will take, and one for the direction that your character will shoot in. So for instance, you can shoot up towards the top of the screen while moving your character down towards the bottom at the same time. Simple enough, right? Using two joysticks solves the problem of characters in pseudo 3D environments that have enemies coming at them from all angles, but traditionally have only been able to shoot in the direction that they're facing. Other arcade games, like Heavy Barrel, handle this in a slightly different manner, instead having a single 8-directional rotating joystick, but having separate buttons for shooting, grenades, etc. These solve the problem as well, but I've always felt the control using these joysticks was a bit more awkward, as you're having to twist the joystick at the same time as using it to move. Now, look at your average Genesis controller real quick. Do you see anything missing based on this description of XenoCrisis? Yeah, as common pre-PlayStation DualShock era, the Genesis controller only has one stick in the D-pad. So how does this work, especially if you're using an original Genesis 3-button controller? Well, Bitmap Bureau offers two options. If you're using a 3-button, and I honestly don't know why you would be in 2020, but if you are, B is configured to be your shot button. And if you need to change the direction you're shooting in, you can either hold B and A to spin left, or B and C to spin right. Very similar to the rotary joysticks in Heavy Barrel I just mentioned. However, the best way to play the game is with a 6-button controller. With a 6-button controller, A fires down, Y is up, X is left, and B is right, and you can hold down 2 buttons to fire in the appropriate diagonal direction. While this configuration isn't as good as having a second D-pad, the buttons on the 6-button controller are slightly offset and angled, so it's at least a close approximation. In both configurations, there's a separate button to throw a grenade or perform a dodge roll, so XenoCrisis isn't exactly a pure twin-stick shooter in that regard, but it's the closest thing that fits the game. Since I've spent all this time describing how the game works, we might as well go ahead and get into how well the controls actually function. In that regard, the answer is really well, considering movement in the game is very fluid, and there's no lag on response times. It does take a bit to get used to using the buttons in replacement of a second stick or D-pad, simply because they're buttons and they aren't connected in any way, so you'll probably be less likely to fire in diagonal directions due to having pressed 2 buttons versus simply pressing in a single direction. But it's all manageable. Even a 3-button configuration isn't awful, but it's certainly much less desirable to attempt to spin in the direction you need to fire, as it takes a second or two, and as the difficulty in the game raises, every second counts. I'm actually curious what the plan is to control the game on the Neo Geo, seeing as how it only has 4 buttons. But that's a different kettle of fish, as it were, and for another phrase that cements just how old I am. The graphics in-game are nothing short of outstanding, especially for the Genesis. The best way I can describe the game is if you mix Metal Slug and Smash TV while fighting aliens. There's a few reasons why I say that, but the main one is because of the character animation. Your character always is moving, even when standing still, and it's a very smoothly animated movement. In the same fashion, all the enemies that you have to take out are similarly well animated, and of course have death animations as well. There's also a good mix of enemies in the game, and frequently per room you'll be facing a few of them. So in that regard, it's not like Smash TV, where the game simply tries to overwhelm you with hordes of the same enemy, depending on what room you're in. Also, there's absolutely no slowdown or flickering in the game, and there are some great, huge multi-sprite bosses that are very uncommon on the Genesis, due to the amount of work needed to make smaller sprites seamlessly animate together. Other than during in-game action, there's also some nice-looking cutscene graphics to tell the story, a la Zero Wing. You can definitely tell there was a lot of time put into making the game look as good as possible, while still working around the Genesis 64 on-screen color limitation. Likewise, the music and sound effects in-game are absolutely stellar, and among the best entries on the console. I own the soundtracks for Streets of Rage 1, 2, and 3 on vinyl that were released by Data, and Bitmap Bureau went the same route and sells the XenoCrisis soundtrack as well, and I've seriously considered purchasing it because it's that good. The music is very intense when it comes to in-game action, which matches up with the frenetic activity on screen, and it's all fantastic quality as well. Bitmap Bureau worked with an artist named Savage Regime, who specializes in composing chiptunes for the Yamaha 2612, and they've really created some special tracks. For all those that think the Genesis isn't capable of decent music or sound, look no further. The game has some speech as well, and it's all clear as a bell with no distortion. I'm sure that probably a significant portion of the game's 32 megabits is dedicated to housing these music tracks and sound effects, as good FM synthesis requires a significant amount of space in comparison to PCM, but it's definitely worth it. So I've spent a lot of time discussing how the game controls well with a 6-button controller, looks great, and sounds fantastic. And I haven't even mentioned how the level's maps are randomly selected from 65,000 possible combinations, so that no two games are the same. Well, unless you're really unlucky. Or how there's a level-up system to make your character more powerful as you go through the game based on the amount of dog tags you pick up, allowing you to pick and choose which aspects of your character to upgrade. It's truly a marvelous release to see, especially for a console whose heyday was almost 30 years ago. Possibly even deserving of the so far elusive first Zilog and Moto 5-star rating. Pump the brakes, kid. There's one major problem I take issue with. XenoCrisis has 2 difficulty levels, easy and hard. The difficulty levels don't seem to do much to change the game experience, other than make the boss fights easier or more difficult depending on what you pick. This is a problem, because the difficulties aren't really easy and hard, it's more like hard and harder. And compounding that problem, to get the real ending to the game, you aren't allowed to use a continue, and your player, while they have a health meter, only has 1 life. Frankly, it's some bullshit. When playing and researching information about the game this week, I found a post from one of the developers on Steam about it, and they really wanted the game to be an old-school, difficult game and reference Ghouls and Ghosts, which famously, if you beat the game, or so you think, then you get sent back to the beginning of the game to beat it again, and then you get the real ending. Well, personally, I've beaten Ghouls and Ghosts, and I don't remember it feeling like this. I get what they're trying to do, but I honestly think it would have been better if, rather than missing out on story, there was a reward for the player beating the game in that manner. For instance, if you beat Streets of Rage 2 on hardest, on the last screen of the ending it gives you a code to open up the cheat menu options. Or perhaps the extra video that plays at the end of the original Halo if you beat it in Legendary. That sort of thing. Thankfully, the developers were smart enough to put cheats in the game to get around this, and some of the action you're seeing in my video is only because of that cheat menu's existence. but this really could have been handled better. All in all, I'm giving XenoCrisis 4 stars. It's agonizingly close to perfect, but the ridiculous difficulty is just over the top for me. If you're a collector for the Genesis or Mega Drive, this is a must-purchase for your collection, and just 1 week into 2020, this might be the best game I review all year. Everything that comes after certainly has a very high watermark to surpass it. And if you're not a retro gamer, I highly recommend you check it out on one of the modern consoles instead, as those versions are technically even better, minus the technical achievement of fitting the game onto a 32-year-old console. The graphics are slightly sharper, and there's more speech added to the game, plus you'll probably be able to actually utilize a true twin-stick setup on a modern controller. Oh, and I shouldn't have to say this, but don't steal this wrong. Pay for the damn game. It's worth every penny, and if you want more games like it, Bitmap Bureau needs the coinage.
And that was XenoCrisis, a near-perfect love letter to Sega's 16-bit powerhouse. Definitely had a lot of fun doing the research for this one. Tune in next week when we switch to the Sega CD and take a look at the first game in a series that we haven't touched so far. Also, fair warning, it's not anywhere near as good as XenoCrisis is. I've got a feeling this week's research is going to be far less enjoyable. Ugh. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.